jungle.
All right. Very much thank you for the MC of the house. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh. Welcome everyone to the second plenary session of the iConnects 2021. I am Anissa Sofarini as the chosen moderator of this session. Allow me to check my audio first. Kindly type anything on the chat box so that I can tell whether or not my voice can be heard clearly. All right. Good to know that you can hear my voice clearly. Please report any technical issues you may get in the chat box or send private chat to me or to the committee. You may tell the committee by searching the ones with the committee level written right after their names. To all participants, for the sake of the smooth running of the speakers' presentations, kindly pay attention to the netiquettes as shown on the screen. Actually, these listed netiquettes were also thoroughly explained in the first plenary session. At this rate, please respect the speaker's presentation time. Please stay muted and do not operate anything on the screen, such as operating annotation or even sharing screen. These two will definitely hinder the visualization of the speaker's presentation slides. To begin with, it needs to acknowledge that it is such a privilege for me to welcome two outstanding speakers in the floor. Associate Professor Suzanne Cho, I beg your sorry if I said wrong, from National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, and Professor Betty McDonald from the University of Trinidad and Tobago. Both are the internationally acknowledged speakers and experts in the field who will bring about the new insights towards the issues at hand. Well, it's time for me to invite and introduce the first speaker in this session, who will address the topic about developing global citizens through the teaching of English. Associate Professor Suzanne Cho from National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Good afternoon, Professor. Are you here?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Good afternoon, Professor.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. All right. So
to Professor Cho, kindly get ready with your presentation. But before jumping right in your presentation, Professor, allow me to get all participants through your biography. Professor Cho is an Assistant Dean, Teacher Leadership at the Office of Teacher Education and Associate Professor in the English Language and Literature Academic Group at the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Let's talk about her research then. Her research has been published in various peer-reviewed journals, such as Harvard Educational Review, Research in the Teaching of English, Asia Pacific Curriculum Inquiry, Discourse Studies in the Cultural Politics of Education, English Journal, Journal of Aesthetic Education, and many more. She has also written numerous books on the literary analysis that are used widely in Singapore schools, as well as edited a short story anthology entitled Crossworld Short Stories on Global Times. She is interested in the issues related to education for global and cosmopolitan citizenship, particularly in relation to literature education. Other interests include the disciplinary history of literature in English, theorization of literature pedagogy, world, global, and cosmopolitan approaches to teaching literature, and ethical criticism. That's all Professor Cho's short biography. It's now for me to invite Professor Cho to come on the floor. So the floor is now yours, Professor, please.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm calling in from Singapore. I hope y'all can hear me. If you can't hear me, let me know anytime. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay, my name is Dr. Suzanne Choo, and I'm from the National Institute of Education in Singapore. Okay, and I'm going to be talking about the importance of developing global citizens through the teaching of English. Okay, so let's get started. The first part of my talk is going to focus on why we need to prepare students for the future. Okay, as we know, we live in a globally interconnected age, right? Globalization is not a new concept. It has been happening since the dawn of mankind, right? When early men left their land to look for new lands, globalization already occurred 4,000 or more years ago, okay? However, as Thomas Friedman says, while there are a lot of similarities between the previous era of globalization and the one that we are now in, what is new today is the degree and intensity with which the world is being tied together in a single global marketplace and village. In other words, what is new about today's globalization is that it's very intense. And this is caused by social media. It's caused by technology that has brought us closer together. At the same time, as the world is becoming closer together, it is also pulled apart by a lot of intolerance, a lot of xenophobia, extremism. We saw recently in the US, white extremists storming the capital city. Okay, another thing about globalization is the uncertainty of the future. OECD says the children entering education in 2018 will be young adults in 2030. Schools can prepare them for jobs that have yet been created, for technologies that have not yet been invented, to solve problems that have yet been anticipated. Okay. So, because of this uncertainty, right, now attention has been shifted from, say, the STEM subjects, which are the science, technology, subjects, to subjects like English, language, literature, arts. Okay, as OECD says, now social emotional skills like empathy and respect for others are becoming essential as classrooms and workplaces become more diverse. It's more and more important that we don't just teach them technical skills, but dispositions like empathy and so on. So what is global citizenship? Okay, global citizenship aims to empower learners to assume active roles to face and resolve global challenges and to become proactive contributors to a more peaceful, tolerant, inclusive, and secure world. This is from UNESCO. So global education is becoming more and more important, and no matter what subject you teach, whether you're an English teacher, you're a math teacher, you're a science teacher, all of us needs to infuse global education in our subjects. We need to train our students and empower them to learn how to use knowledge to make our world more inclusive and more tolerant. But I want to pay a special attention to English. English is especially important today, right? In developing global citizenship. Why? Because it is a global language. It has attained the status of a global language and a lingua franca, which is a bridge language. It bridges different communities and different cultures. In the realm of politics, English is one of the main official languages used in major international organizations like the UN and World Bank, in regional organizations like APEC, ASEAN. Okay, more than 50 countries around the world use English as an official language. It is the most popular official language in the world today. In terms of culture, why did English attain the status of a global language? I think it's caused by superpowers like Britain first and then the United States. They spread English around the world along with the immigrants who came to the countries. Right? Today, English is spoken by millions of people around the world. Now, in terms of capitalism, more than 300 of the major transnational and multinational organizations that control 25% of the world's capital, English is the working language used in many of these organizations, and some of our students may end up working for them in the future. And in terms of technology, English users dominate the internet. In research as well, English language journals dominate the field. This is why English plays a key role in developing our students as global citizens. So this is just my introduction. But today's talk, I want to focus on the how. How can we develop global awareness through the use of English? I want to give you 6 pedagogical strategies, and I'm going to use examples from my research with schools around the world. For many years, I have done research with students in Australia, in Singapore, in the United States, around the world. Okay, and I'm going to share some of this research with you. Okay, first strategy is we can consider how we can design curriculum around global issues. Okay, so let me just explain this. Excuse me. Now, globalization is not something outside, right? It's something that exists within a country. Globalization, or the word is global. That means globalization is part and parcel of everyday life. So, to identify this global issue, we can ask ourselves, what issue is most widely discussed today? What are the stereotypes that students might have that can be disrupted about this issue? Can we design a unit around this issue? Can we select literary as well as non-fiction text, documentaries, memoirs, around this issue? And can we give students the opportunity to connect these texts to other texts and to their society, to the world, and to theories about human nature and human rights? Okay, so what are some of these global issues? For a start, we can refer to the United Nations Sustainable Goals. We can design lessons around, say, number 1, poverty, hunger, what is well-being, what is quality education, gender rights, water, energy, right? Economic growth, right? Inequality, peace, justice, and so on. So these are useful goals. And for each of these goals, we can design unit plans. Unit plans consist of, say, 6 to 8 lesson plans around each of these goals. Let me give you one example of a teacher I observed. This was in the United States. It was a year 4, they are about 16 years old. And this was an English class. Now, in the past, the students used to study this book called A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. And she used to focus on the language, right? The plot, the character, the language, the style. But that year when I observed her, the whole school was focusing on global education. So she decided to change her unit plan. She framed the unit around the theme of poverty with these questions. How do issues that people struggle with today compare to what the French and English experienced in the 18th century? Because A Tale of Two Cities is set in the 18th century. How do the author's use of style and characterization create social commentary? Now, what I thought was very interesting is that they looked at Charles Dickens as a social critic. Charles Dickens wrote and criticized the issues of poverty in England at the time. So the students looked at Charles Dickens as a social critic, and then they worked in groups to think about who are the social critics in America now. They looked at Newsweek, they looked at Time, they looked at Economist, okay? And then they compared how do these different social critics write about poverty as compared to Charles Dickens, right? And then they did a ranking exercise, and then they evaluated who was more effective in writing about social commentary. So this is a very good example of how, instead of just focusing on the linguistics and the literary style of a text, you can also infuse global issues, right, as you teach English. Now, second thing is stereotypes. There are a lot of stereotypes right now caused by mass media and social media, okay, especially people making fun of other groups. So we can also design curriculum around stereotypes. We begin with what are students' stereotypical impressions or stereotypes perpetuated by mass media. And then we think about how we can disrupt these stereotypes. For example, we can introduce other texts that might complicate students' understanding. We can encourage comparisons. So if they are reading a text written by an American, maybe we can introduce a text written by an Asian so that they can compare different perspectives. Let me give you another example. This is a recent one, a teacher that I worked with on the topic of race and identity. And if you have lived in Singapore, you know that Singapore is a multicultural society. We have 74% Chinese, 22% Malays, 13% Indians, and other races, Eurasians, and so on. Race is a very sensitive issue in Singapore, but increasingly there have been issues of racism, and therefore we decided we should tackle it in the classroom. Instead of avoiding the topic, we should allow students to explore it. So this teacher started with the question, what makes a place somebody's home? And we explored a poem, a very well-known poem called Foreign by the poet Carol Ann Duffy, and a short story called Everest, which is about an Indian family trying to adjust to Singapore society. And what was interesting is that he got students to think about identity. What makes or shapes our identity? He got students to think about stereotypes that are tied to identity. For example, he wrote on the board, citizen versus foreigner. What are our impressions of these two terms? What about Chinese versus Malay? What are impressions of these terms? After that, there was a discussion about how identities become stereotypes and what is the effect of stereotypes. How can stereotypes hurt other people? After that, we went back, the teacher went back to the short story to talk about how a family struggled. The story was about how a family struggled with their identity, right? At the end of it, the whole lesson, right? The students gain greater empathy, okay, for those people who are hurt by stereotypes. So one very useful pedagogy that I saw is called the It's Not Okay template. So what the teacher did, this is in Instagram. If you go to Instagram and you key in hashtag not okay, you can find a lot of these posts, okay? So the teacher took this post and showed some examples. It's not okay to fill in the blanks. Instead, try to fill in the blanks. So she got students to, each of them write according to this template. So some of them said it's not okay to say that the virus, to call the virus Wuhan virus, right? Because it assumes, it stereotypes Chinese people. Instead, try to be sensitive to others. It's not okay to make racist jokes or racist slurs. Instead, you know, try to be understanding and that is offensive to others. So every student wrote, and it was anonymous, and then she had other students read out, you know, these texts that the students wrote, okay? And at the end, it really created a very safe space for students to share how they have been hurt by stereotypes and what they didn't like, right? And it surfaced issues of bullying in the classroom that the teacher could then tackle. So I want to add that literary text that we use is very important in fostering the hospitable imagination. by disrupting habitual and narrow ways of seeing the world and seeing others, right? We can use literature and literary text, stories and narratives, right, to disrupt some of the stereotypes that students have. The third strategy is how we can analyze text using what I call an ethical lens. Now, traditionally, when we read stories, we typically read it through what is called the 5 areas of study. The 5 areas of study are plot, okay, where we look at what is the story, what's the conflict, okay, then we look at character, who are the key characters, what is their role, their relationships, setting and atmosphere, where is it set, the time and place, the mood, the style, okay, the figurative language, the point of view, the tone, the form, the theme. So usually we look at text using these 5 areas of study. This is taken from our Ministry of Education literature syllabus. However, what I want to suggest is that to develop global citizens, you also need to infuse ethical questions. And we can infuse ethical questions in each of these areas. So, for example, when you're looking at a story, instead of just looking at plot, we can look at what is called ethical dilemmas. In terms of setting, instead of just looking at where is the story taking place, where's the time and space, we can look at this question of borders. Where are the physical and spatial borders? How is it connected to power and injustice? Character, instead of just saying who's a good character, who's a bad character, what are their character traits, we can look at this question of values and virtues. So let me give you an example. This is a very well-known story. This is around the first part of the story, called The Ones Who Walk Away from a Malice. Okay, I'm just going to read this paragraph to you, but basically the story is about a very happy place. It's like heaven. Everybody's very happy. And then we come to this paragraph where it says, let me read, in the basement, under one of the beautiful public buildings of Omelas, or perhaps in the cellar of one of its spacious private homes, there is a room. It has one locked door and no window. The room is about 3 paces long and 2 wide. A mere broom closet or disused room. Okay, in the room, a child is sitting. They all know it is there, all the people of Omelas. Some of them have come to see it. Others are content merely to know it is there. They all know that it has to be there. Some of them understand why and some do not. They all understand that their happiness, the beauty of the city, the tenderness of their friendships, the health of their children, the wisdom of their scholars, the skill of their makers, even the abundance of their harvest and the kindly weathers of the sky depend on this child's misery. Okay, so basically this story is about this very happy place, but in the basement there is the young child who's locked up in this prison cell. Okay, and he's abused and neglected and so on. Okay, so what do you think is the ethical dilemma in this story? Instead of just summarizing the story, most students will just summarize the story. We can ask them, identify the ethical dilemma. An ethical dilemma means that you have to choose between 2 options. Each option has undesirable consequences. Each option is equally conflicting, and therefore it opens space for debate. The aim of the ethical dilemma is to look at what is the philosophical idea the author is exploring. For example, in this text, the ethical dilemma is this, right? Suffering must be witnessed, right? We need to witness other people's suffering in order to remind ourselves what happiness is. Option number 2 is suffering should not be witnessed. But if we don't witness suffering, then we do not know what happiness is. So this is the ethical dilemma. And even though this is a story, it's also very real in real life, right? We make other people suffer so that we are happy. For example, some people are slaves, right? They make products like our iPhones, our iPads, so that we are comfortable. We have all the necessities, right? No, so the philosophical issue that the author is exploring is something called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism means that the majority is happy at the expense of a minority. Okay? Now, a lot of literary texts, actually a lot of literary books explore this concept of utilitarianism. One very well-known one that I think a lot of young people know is the Hunger Games. If you remember the Hunger Games, every year 1 or 2 people have to die in the Hunger Games in order for the society to remain peaceful. Okay, another story I like is called The Elephant Vanishes by Murakami. And then there's the lottery. They're all the same. The lottery is about every year, the whole town has to come and stone one girl, one random person, in order to secure the safety of all. So it would be helpful if teachers have a basic understanding of ethics, right? Especially these two terms, utilitarianism, which is the greatest happiness for the greatest number, versus the ontology, which is adherence to universal principles. Both are opposite, okay? Utilitarianism means that we treat others as an end in order for the majority to be at peace. The opposite of this is the ontology, which is universal values like human rights, right? Instead of using other people, we should have universal rights to respect the dignity of everyone, even minorities. So this is something that students can debate in the class. Okay, second, instead of plot, we can also look at setting. Look at the setting of this story. It's set in a city called Omelas, but there's also another kind of setting, the basement. It is said that the basement is under the public building. So we can ask, where are the borders? Where are the spatial borders that differentiates the us, those in power, versus them, the minorities? And that is the basement here. Then we can ask, who has the power to name these borders? And what are the dominant values reinforced? Here, there's the word they. So those in power, right? How do they make it normal for violence to occur? And finally, how can we envision ways of living together? This is something that students can discuss. What policies or laws can support the flourishing of everyone in society, especially those who are minorities? Okay. Finally, character, right? Character is a very common question in reading. Whenever we read stories, we often ask students to evaluate characters, whether they are good or bad. But how do we evaluate whether a character is good or bad, right? We can look at this concept of virtue, which comes from Aristotle. Virtue refers to habitual dispositions, characteristic of human excellence. We can evaluate virtue by asking how a person demonstrates what is called the golden mean, the balance. Okay, according to Aristotle, virtue is the balance between extremes. For example, courage is the mean or the balance between cowardice and being rash, right? Modesty is the balance between humility and pride, right? So virtue is actually determined by how balanced a person is, and also the underlying values that guides a person's behavior. We can explore when a person behaves a certain way. What's the value system that guides a person? We can look at how the character responds to dilemmas. Every story has an ethical. How does the character respond to it? This tells you whether the character exhibits virtue. Okay, and how does the character develop in the long term? Right? So along with this idea, we can also incorporate opportunities for students to explore human rights and justice in their lessons, right? Instead, again, of focusing just on teaching them the skills of comprehension and all that, we can also bring in human rights questions. This is a very useful framework, okay? And these are some questions you can ask students to explore as they read. It can be applied to any text. So 1, what human rights themes appear in the work? What rights are enjoyed? Are human rights in conflict? Are human rights denied? Who is responsible for the human rights abuse? Who is acting to defend the rights? Who does not act to defend the rights? Then second question, if human rights are defended, what action is being taken? Okay, and how would the outcome be different if a different kind of action is taken? And then instead of talking about human rights all the time, we can focus on this concept of human dignity. Every human being longs for dignity, for recognition. What does the work say about human dignity? Is it affirmed or denied? What does the work say about individual responsibility? How are we responsible for somebody else? How are we responsible for the dignity and the flourishing of other people? Number 5 is, what about your own country? What about your own community? Do you see violations of human rights issues? Do you see injustice there? What can you do to defend the rights of others? Research one of the authors. Are there events, people, or places that have shaped their opinions on human rights? This is a excerpt of a unit plan that I designed for a secondary 1 English classroom some years back. Secondary 1 in Singapore is like 13 years old. Okay, and it was on human rights. And we focus on viewing, reading, writing, listening, speaking, grammar, but I'm just going to focus on the 3, which is viewing, reading, and writing. So the first week, we focus on the concept of rights. Okay, in viewing, they look at immigrant communities in Singapore. Okay, and they look at various photographs of migrants in Singapore. Okay, and they thought about this question of what are the rights that protect all these migrant workers, like the foreign domestic, the helpers, the maids, the migrant laborers. Right? So in terms of reading, they read up about the history of human rights. They also read short stories around this idea of human rights. We focus on the key skill of audience. Every week there was a key skill. So they look at who is the target audience in these works. In terms of writing, we got them to think about the concept of rights and how does rights affect a student, a citizen, a human being. And then they had to prepare a speech, okay, to promote the rights as students. Then in week 2, we focus on World War II. We look at the violation of the right to life in World War II. We look at anti-Semitism and racism in World War II under the Nazis, right? We look at Hitler and Churchill's speeches, okay, focusing on audience, tone, and choice of words, okay? And then they did, in terms of writing, they did research on how a particular community in Singapore has been violated. They wrote a draft as a whole group to defend the rights of this community. In weeks 3, they looked at other countries aside from World War II. They looked at a graphic novel called The Arrival by Sean Tan. In terms of skills, we focus on figurative language in speeches. They looked at how politicians speak about asylum seekers, and they analyzed persuasive speech. So in terms of writing, they use persuasive language to refine their speeches. And then in week 4, they focus on immigrants again and foreigners adjusting. They looked at short stories, news articles, and then they wrote a formal letter. So you can see in every week we infuse English language skills like persuasive writing, formal letter writing, speeches. We also taught them, the skills of reading, like target, audience, tone, perspective, word choice. But the whole unit was crafted around human rights and getting with the idea of human rights. Okay, the 5th strategy is, it's not just about teaching in the classroom, but it's also about assessment. In our assessment for English, usually we test comprehension type questions. Okay, like what happened here, summarize this passage. Right, but we can also infuse ethical questions. And here I want to draw attention to the International Baccalaureate, which I find is a very rigorous and yet holistic curriculum, and with a very strong emphasis on global and international mindedness. The IB curriculum is centered around this notion of readers, writers, and text, right? Paying close attention to literary stylistic language, but also time and space, how text are rooted in cultural, historical perspectives and intertextuality. So they focus a lot on not just reading one text, but looking at how one text connects to other texts. Now, in the IB's literature assessment structure, you'll see that there are in external assessment, which is 80%. And in the external assessment, the students have to do close analysis, usually of literary texts, okay, like short stories or poems. Okay, they compare a form or theme, like how two or more writers in particular places or settings are significant. But they also have this paper too, which is a comparative essay, right? Where they have to compare two different texts. And usually these texts are from different cultures. One could be from America or UK, and one could be from Asia. They compare, they look at ethical concepts like identity, culture, creativity, perspectives, representation, and so on. Now, there's also a 20% internal assessment, and I think that this is the very interesting thing about the IB, is the internal assessment, which is assessed by the school, involves a global issue portfolio, okay? In other words, students have to prepare a portfolio where they look at literary works in relation to a global issue. So they investigate two works, one in original language and one in translation, in connection to a global issue. Okay, so they could explore family, class, race, ethnicity, religion, gender, and so on. They can explore politics and power. They can explore values, belief systems, and how it shapes communities. So I think this is not very common in a lot of other exam assessments, but the IB focuses on global issues. Okay, so texts can no longer be seen as aesthetic artifacts, but as bridges to ethical engagements with individuals and communities in the world. And this is a framework that I would suggest we consider. It has text, reader, and other. As we engage in text, we think about critical appreciation and evaluation of text. But the reader domain also places emphasis on how we can get readers to engage with other texts. Okay? And finally, the ethical domain, which is called the other. How does a text promote understanding of others in the world? So we can design curriculum where we look at text, analyzing text, looking at the linguistic characteristics of text. We can include reader-centered domain where we encourage readers to engage with the text actively, and creatively, and as well as the ethical aspect of it. And each of these has different types of skills. In the text domain, it is about understanding, analyzing, synthesizing, evaluating text. In the reader domain, it's about activating the reader's engagement, so allowing the reader to question, respond, imagine, and create text. And in the other domain, which is the ethical domain, it's about connecting text to other texts, to the society, to the world, and to theories about human rights and human dignity. Let me end with the last strategy. I think my time is coming up. So how do we encourage wide reading of world literature to explore global issues? Right? And here, this was a class that I observed in one of the international schools in Singapore. I thought it was very interesting because when you enter the class, you see that the setup is a U shape. In other words, it's very conference style. Students are seated around the table, and along the walls of the room, you can see are books. These are the teacher's own books. So there's a library in the class, and the books are from all over the world. Okay, and the teacher has designated for every week, there's 15 minutes of curriculum time to silent reading, to independent reading. Students can select any book that they want. They can take it from the library here that has books from everywhere in the world, or they can choose their own books. Okay, but they must they must try to read at least 25 books in a whole year. They can read any book that they want. The idea is that they read and they are interested in reading. And that's why the teacher allows them to choose books that they want to read. Okay. And then every class, during the 15 minutes of independent reading, the teacher will go around to each student and do what is called conferencing. He will ask each student, what have you been reading? What did you learn about their reading? Students have also got to do like journaling. They also have book festivals where they share about the books they have read. So I think it's a really great culture where we encourage wide reading and reading about other places, okay, and other cultures in the world. I want to recommend a few young adult stories that you can use, and these are all on global issues. So for example, there are a lot of books on terrorism. For example, Shooting Kabul is a book that is widely used in Singapore schools. It is about a family escaping the Taliban in Afghanistan, and then they flee to America, and then 9/11 happens, and they face all sorts of discrimination. So it's a very good book to help understand what's happening in the world, the effects of terrorism. There are a lot of books on human rights. Okay, Fire in the Soul is about 100 poems on human rights. There are two very good anthologies by Amnesty International called Freedom. The third book, Freedom, the one you see here in green, is written by authors from around the world, very well-known authors. Okay, the yellow one you see at the end called Free is the same, but it's targeted at younger readers, say 13, 14-year-olds. Okay. Another anthology I recommend is Literature from the Axis of Evil, the second one you see here. It is literature, it's short stories, poems from countries like North Korea, Syria, Cuba, what is called Axis of Evil countries. Sorry, I hear is somebody saying something? Okay. There's a lot of literature on immigration, power and conflict, like The House on Mango Street, which is on immigration. I mentioned the graphic novel Sean Tan, which is an excellent book about the experiences of people who migrate. Okay, there's also a lot of young adult literature on difficult issues. So it's about human trafficking. Okay, Wonder is a great book, also very well used in Singapore schools. It's about bullying. If you face bullying in your schools, then I think this is a great book to explore, because it explores bullying from multiple perspectives, from even the angle of the bully. Why does a person bully, right? And the how it affects the family. So let me end with some final thoughts. I'm going to give you a few quotes. The first is that language is not merely a means of communicating, but a means to understanding others. So don't just think of yourself as a language teacher where you teach skills, but you're also an ethical teacher. Through language, you can teach ethics. You can foster understanding of others through the stories and the texts that you choose. Language provides the bridge between self and other. The essence of language is friendship and hospitality. Friendship, because it is through language that we learn to connect with someone else, someone who might be different from us, someone who might have different beliefs and different backgrounds. And finally, language and literature provides a platform for applied ethics. Stories that we learn to think about the virtual cases that echo the real cases we meet when we return to the actual world. Every story that we read has an ethical issue. The ethical issue we see in stories reflect what is happening in the real world. So we can train students to be ethically minded, and in the process, they become more empathetic, they become more open to others in the world. As I end this conversation, if you are interested in some of the resources I've shared, you can visit my website on young adult literature, where I have a range of recommended young adult literature on global issues. I also have a website on various units I worked with teachers around Asia, exploring Asia through poetry and race and identity. And finally, you can email me, suzanne.choo@nie.edu.sg. There's also a book that we've published recently called Literature Education in the Asia Pacific. Thank you very much for your time. I will stop the screen share now.
Very much thank you, Professor Choo. It's indeed a great and insightful presentation. We've now figured out the strategies to develop global awareness in English education, and one of them is adjusting the literature or text by infusing the ethical questions. Also, why the issue of global citizenship should be one of the concerns of English educators or other educators as well. Now, allow me to open the Q&A portion for Professor Choo. However, there are several things to note by all participants here. Due to limited time, only one question that will be responded by Professor Choo. Other questions coming in will be gathered and emailed to Professor Choo. To the ones who have already dropped questions, please provide your active email, please. Right, let's read the first question coming in to me from Benny. Mr. Benny asked you, Professor, sorry, how could we support teachers and schools which have limited resources to engage students in global education enriched activities? And how to embed the pedagogy possessed by the teachers about global education to the textbook used by the students in the classroom?
Okay, let me talk. Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you. I just want to mention that there are a lot of free resources on the internet. Okay, I'm going to type it in the chat, but you can go to this website that I love. It's called Words Without Borders. Okay, let me just type it out here. I think if you go to Google and you just key in this, you go to this website. Words Without Borders basically has poems, short stories, non-fiction, articles by very well-known writers around the world. And they have a very good magazine, okay, that features their key works. So again, a lot of this is free, right? You can always download the text and then use it in your classroom, okay? Now, the thing is that I'm not familiar with the textbook that you are using in your schools, but one of the things that I encourage teachers is what I call reading the text, reading around the text, and reading against the text. Let me explain these three things. Reading the text means that you might have a central textbook. So you read the text, you understand what the text is trying to say, you comprehend the text. Now, reading around the text means that you bring in other things from outside to complement the reading of this text. Reading around the text could involve reading news articles. It could involve reading short stories, poems that are connected to this text. And you help students see the connections. Because a lot of times students do not see the connections between the text and the real world. So you bring in other texts to help them read around it. Okay, reading against the text means that every text has certain assumptions and bias. Okay, so for example, the text you read could come from a particular culture. Reading against the text means that you interrupt the text with a... So for example, if you are reading a text that has only one point of view, can you find another text that gives a different point of view? That's called reading against the text. So this is just a very simple strategy for teachers to think about when you design your curriculum. Okay, reading the text, reading around the text, and reading against the text. As I mentioned, reading around the text and reading against the text. If you need resources, there are a lot of things available actually on the internet. Okay, there's another excellent website by Amnesty International called Fiction and Human Rights. I will, yeah, I think it's called Amnesty International. If you If you key in this website, they have a lot of resources that's available. I'm just going to key in the chat here. Okay, and you can actually download a lot of this and use it for class. Thank you.
All right.
60-an guys, Pak. Orang lah, itu sana, kerung itu lah. Oh, ngomongin aku di mana? Dulu ya aku. Nah.
Sorry, so all participants, please mute. Okay. Yeah, sorry, Professor.
No problem. Any other question? I think our time is running out, is it? Okay.
Yeah, it's already come to an end. So I think I will end the Q&A portion for now, Professor. That's all the first presentation in the second plenary session of the iConnects 2021. Thank you again, Professor Suzanne Choo, for the outstanding talk, and for all participants here for showing the very active engagement. Please make a round of applause by typing clap, clap, clap in the chat box.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor.
Audio Jungle.